I ask every candidate the same series of questions at every step in the process.
My name's Chris Bussing. Welcome to my channel. It's committed to helping more people create lives of freedom and impact through success in tech sales and the pursuit of self-development. I've got an amazing guest today, Seth List, who is an SDR nerd. He's an SDR superstar that became a consultant that actually advises companies on how to build their SDR orgs, and he's also a revenue operator as well. And we'll get into what that term actually means. But this guy is a beast. So you're going to want to stay for the whole conversation to learn about everything SDRing and how to be successful in sales development in tech sales, and how to even think about running an SDR org organizationally, from hiring to setting KPIs and everything in between. So without further ado, let's get into it. Seth, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
So first off, let's address a quote that you have on your LinkedIn profile that's pretty hilarious. You can't sell ice to an Eskimo, but maybe if they like you, they might buy a snow cone. What does that mean to you?
Yeah, I think that it originated just thinking a lot about the viability of selling something to someone that they don't actually need, that they may even have a surplus of, coupled with the idea that sales, in my opinion, is still very much a human job. It was when I wrote that quote. It still is today. And so things like likability, trustworthiness, candor, those count for something. And so, yeah, that's kind of the origins of that quote. And it serves as a pretty good reminder for myself that even if somebody doesn't buy today, if you treat them with kindness and respect, you may leave the door open for them to buy something else from you down the road.
Already a mic drop.
Nah.
Sales is about likability, trustworthiness, candor. These are things we're all capable of, right? But it's kind of funny. I'm curious, do you think some people are just wired to be that way, or those actually are, I guess, trainable ways of being?
A little bit of both. I fear that I may give you a lot of those answers today, which is that it depends. But I think as humans, we're all capable of kindness and candor and empathy, kind of a general appreciation for the human on the other side of the equation. That said, these skills are like muscles. We have to use them and practice them and build them over time. And to some degree, they are use or lose. It's something that I try to keep at the forefront. I don't look at my own LinkedIn profile every day, but I'm very aware of that quote that I put out there.
Yeah.
And I try to carry that with me on a daily basis, which is to remind myself that these are skills that I need to practice and use.
What's a simple way to build trustworthiness or trust with a prospect? Just like maybe one example. I know there's probably many in a sales interaction where a seller could actually build some trust.
Genuine curiosity. I think we talk a lot about the notion of curiosity in sales, but I think it's an important distinction that it has to be wholehearted and genuine. Because the flip side of the equation is, in terms of our natural wiring, as buyers, we know when we're being BS'd. We know when we're being coerced or manipulated, when a question is simply a setup for a pitch. And so as a seller approaching with genuine curiosity, I'm a big fan of Josh Braun and his content, but the notion of letting go of the outcome, detaching, right? And that really comes through. So yeah, I think that is critical, is to show up and to genuinely and actively listen for the answers, not just wait for your opportunity to speak.
What a powerful way of being, not just in sales, but in life. How about candor? Could you give me an example of like maybe a time you displayed candor with a prospect?
I mean, truth be told, I feel like I display candor every day. I display candor with my team, with my boss, certainly with prospects. But it's small things like acknowledging at the top of a conversation that, like, I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to learn more about you and share how we help companies like yours. And like, when we get to the end of the conversation, we can decide together, if and when we talk again, to try to alleviate a degree of pressure, to kind of state explicitly that I am not attached to the outcome, but that my intent is to be fully present in this conversation. And again, treat the prospect like an active participant with agency and autonomy to make a decision for themselves about whether it genuinely makes sense to continue talking.
So I was introduced to you through Kayn Wright, and she is an incredible person. Every time I speak with her, I feel like I'm shot out of a cannon, and I actually had a podcast interview with her as well, and she had spoken so highly of you. And she said you were just incredible, like as a person, but also in terms of sales development. And she said I had to meet you. So I'm just so grateful to finally be able to meet you and learn from you and build our, relationship. And she did allude to the fact that you really were an SDR guru, and I saw on LinkedIn, and I know you don't keep track of it all the time, that you're an SDR nerd. So I just want to dig into, what does being an SDR nerd mean to you?
It means a lot of things. If I attempt to try to simplify it, it's just that I truly, deeply, wholeheartedly believe in the value and merit of sales development as a function in technology sales. Now, not every business at every time and every capacity, but more often than not, sales development represents promise. The how we do it and the expectations of the program also matter a lot. But as I've grown in my career and continued to make this conscious choice to stay in the sales development function, my mind gets blown on a pretty regular basis. My thinking expands. So, Kayn and I crossed paths at Bizarre Voice in 2008. She was a recruiter at the time and facilitated my hiring process. And back then, the way that I talked about myself was I'm a really effective wind-up toy, right? You pull the string and you point me at the account, and I go, bust through walls, which was true.
I love that.
But 15 years out, maybe a little more, my thinking has broadened significantly, still with a focus on sales development. But that's to say, I have, in the last 5 years, held responsibility for the inbound SDR program, which has afforded opportunities to really deeply dig in and collaborate with marketing, not just their strategy and their spend, but the operational piece, the scoring of leads, the handoff process, the thoughtful consideration for the customer experience, right? And then on the flip side of that equation, because sales development is essentially the ampersand between sales and marketing, but the flip side of that equation is, how do I best serve and support my internal customer, which is sales, and the broader business implications of that. So understanding today in a way that I didn't 10 years ago, what sits in the model, as CEOs make commitments to investors and board and lay out the assumptions and the expectations of how their business will perform. I've now had opportunities of late to get more involved in what do we expect and what is realistic and what historical data do we have to make good and informed assumptions about how this go-to-market program, and then more specifically each of these sub-functions, how they're expected to perform, and learning more about how to, it's not tea leaves, but kind of interpret and read the reporting to understand, are we on track based on what we expected and assumed for this program or not? And if not, what are we going to go do about it? And again, the realization that as an SDR nerd, my job is to be curious and thoughtful and to not try to do it all on my own, but to engage my peers in sales and marketing to say, how are we going to solve this problem? Because it's a connected chain, right? No single function operates wholly independently or autonomously from the other. Sales development, marketing, ideally are in lockstep. And so, I really relish the opportunity to be in the seat that I am now at the organization that I'm with today, and the several in the last few years that afford me the chance to sit at the table and participate in those conversations with a pretty deep knowledge base and years of experience in sales development specifically.
How do you measure the success of an SDR organization? And I don't know if this ties into the theme of you being a revenue operator, but just how do you measure the success of an SDR org?
I think it depends on the business and the maturity of both the business itself and the revenue program. I myself am kind of a startup junkie, and so the lion's share of the organizations that I've worked for are somewhere between, angel seed funding to Series B. You typically see some of that kind of rinse and repeat or repeatability of the revenue program come to life at Series B, certainly Series C. So for the organizations that I'm in, right, we don't know what we don't know in building an SDR program from scratch. my guidance as a consultant when dealing with, founders, CEOs, sales leaders that are just starting to build their sales program. My guidance and kind of caution is to forego the idea that outcomes are guaranteed and instead think about it as an experiment with a keener focus on what are the leading indicators. Lagging comes once you establish a program and can start to run that on repeat. So, common metrics are going to be meetings set, meetings held, opportunities qualified. But the challenge is that a lot of those KPIs, certainly qualified opportunities, is rather subjective and business specific. What I deem a qualified opportunity or deal today in my business may be vastly different from the definition in your organization today. And so it's a really hard question to answer. But in attempting to do it, I think, again, early days, success of SDR programs should center largely on leading indicators. If we approach prospects in our ICP, both by, company criteria and the identity or persona of the people we're approaching, can we even get them to talk to us? Because the singular focus on SDR program, we put X dollars into SDR program and it should yield Y in qualified pipe or new business. Again, in a more mature business, that may be a realistic expectation. What I often find, both as an employee and a consultant working with early stage companies, is that a lack of lagging indicators, ideal outcomes from the SDR program, isn't always a deficiency on the SDR program itself. Specific examples: company has an established product market fit. They haven't established their positioning and how they convey their value proposition in a similar but differentiated way from a category that they want to be in. So there are invaluable insights that sales development can generate by simply approaching the market, testing messaging, and serve as a feedback conduit to product, to marketing, to some degree to engineering. Right, as you socialize, this is what we do, this is the value we believe it creates. You've got to corroborate that with the market, and sales development can be a really effective tool or mechanism by which to do that. But the people in leadership have to go into the program with that expectation that it may not work today, and it's not to say it can never work, but what are the things that we need to do as a business outside of the selling function that better set our sales team up for success? And again, common themes are that the product doesn't wow customers in the way that we believe it would or should. So we're kind of back to the drawing board in terms of positioning, in terms of category ID, in terms of feature functionality. In some cases, you learn that the buyer you thought you were going to sell to isn't actually the right person. So sales development is back to the drawing board and runs another experiment to see if we go after finance versus operations. Does it change our outcomes? But sales development from scratch in the first year really is an experiment. I wouldn't center on outcomes.
Why do you love startups? Because clearly you have that startup itch and you've crushed it at a bunch of startups.
I find startups to be a really interesting puzzle, kind of like a fun little Rubik's Cube. I'm very fascinated by some of these key concepts. It's interesting. There are, I think in any role, but with a focus on sales development, there's kind of a short list of best practices that, in the absence of past success with the program, in the absence of anyone in seat today doing the job, you kind of come to the table. I come to the table with an early hypothesis about these are the three best practices that we should start here and start to run experiments and see what happens. But the real fun part is when you start to get some data back into the machine. We run an experiment, we look at what we did, we look at the outcomes, and then have a conversation about where do we go from here. And the exercise of that, I think I'm hardwired as a community creature, a team player. I really enjoy collaboration within the go-to-market program, that interacting with sales and marketing leadership and SOPs and MOPs, revenue operations at large. But I find it all really fascinating. And again, the deeper I get into my career, the more I understand how integrated and connected all of these functions are. And so today I report to the CEO. That's not uncommon for me to report to somebody in the C-suite, and it affords me a seat at the table, and it's just a whole lot of fun for me. I don't know that it is for everybody, but I find it very fascinating.
It's pretty cool to have that level of impact working directly with the CEO, impacting, exposure and distribution in the market and revenue. So I have this individual from the audience, I believe it's Sarah, in mind right now. She reached out to me and we had a call yesterday, and she's looking to explore tech sales for the first time. She's in medical device sales. And what if she has that entrepreneurial itch and that startup itch, and she's like, oh, I don't want to get in like a big tech enterprise? How would she go about finding a good startup to work for? And keep in mind, again, you're transitioning to tech sales for the first time, and you don't have the experience that the Seth List does.
Yeah, it's funny because I actually just had a similar conversation with someone yesterday, a gentleman that I know from the UK who reached out and said, I'm thinking about a career change. He's in recruiting today and fascinated, kind of curious about the idea of tech sales, and wanted to know my opinion on starting in sales development versus pursuing an account executive role. We touched on the notion of customer success. He's got wonderful people skills and kind of weighing the pros and cons of each. Whether it's Sarah or my buddy in the UK or anyone else who asks, the thing that I tend to harp on, the soapbox I get on, is kind of context and transferability of skills. So if we take it out of a tech sales context and maybe think in a sports context, med device sales is a sport with a ball, but I don't know that med device is comparable to rugby versus tech sales as American football.
Yep.
It may be more akin to, soccer or tennis even, right? There's a similarity.
There's a big difference between soccer and tennis, by the way.
Yes.
Really is. So.
Yeah. And baseball, and you can go volleyball. You can go down the list. Plenty of sports where you use a ball to play, but team versus individual. What kind of court? How do you score a point? How many points per, et cetera? My point being that experience in medical device sales is good and valuable sales experience, but translating that into a tech sales environment, the things that come to mind offhand as far as difference and disparity is med device sales. In many cases, you're selling it's a one-time purchase of a hard good. Maybe there's some technology that goes along to service that, but my understanding of med devices, you're selling devices. The fundamental difference is in tech sales, in almost every case, you're selling a subscription, which makes for a different process. Your buyers are likely to be vastly different. Selling cycles, who you're compared against, measured against, what's driving purchase decisions, needs may be fuzzier when selling to a technology buyer as compared to somebody in a medical device context. And so I often advise candidates to be thoughtful about what skills do I bring to the table, what experience do I have that is relevant and applicable today if I were to jump into a tech sales role, and where do I have relevant experience, but the context is different enough that I've got a learning curve ahead of me. And if I were a candidate today, early in my career, trying to translate previous experience into a new role in tech sales, I'm looking for like the lowest common denominator. What is most akin to what I've done before? Because I want to set myself up to be successful, not have a really frustrating and challenging 6-month run in a tech company where I can check the box and say, I got a tech sales job, but I fell on my face, either because I didn't know enough to go pursue opportunities to educate myself and hack the learning curve, or I joined an organization who is nascent enough, immature enough, that the business was not in a position to provide me with the enablement and the training that I need. And I find that to be a really common pitfall for early sales talent, is kind of getting it in their head that I'm capable of being a founding SDR on a team. I've had 1 or 2 previous runs as an SDR, and they were quite successful. And they pick up that experience and put it in a wholly different context, and they fail. And that's really painful for everybody involved. It's certainly painful for the person making the leap. It's painful for the organization that feels like there may have been overpromise, underdeliver from the talent. And again, I often, as a hiring authority in a startup context, which has kind of been the rule the last 10, 12 years of my career, I have very candid conversations with candidates and say, Chris, you're smart and capable. I'd be setting you up to fail by hiring you for this job because I'm one person. I have no internal training or enablement resources, and we don't have a playbook for onboarding. So let's talk again in a year. And I may even go as far as like making introductions for really solid candidates to organizations that I think are better positioned to
Yes.
help them make that leap, which wins me points on both sides, right? Like just candor and transparency with the candidate, which is sadly kind of uncommon these days about why I'm not going to move them forward in process. And also connecting them to a hiring authority that may greatly appreciate that I've already done an initial screening, that I've kind of passed them off with my endorsement or vote of approval. But we're all kind of in this together, right? Like it doesn't benefit me to be a jerk or to withhold feedback, candid, critical feedback for candidates that will help them accomplish their goal, just not with me. And for other hiring authorities, right, I find this to be a common maybe shortcoming or misunderstanding for early hiring authorities as well. Folks who do 6, 12, 18 months really successfully as an SDR, they move into leadership. Now they're on the hook to hire and making similar mistakes because they don't know what they don't know, which is ask the questions about what have you done, Mr. and Mrs. Candidate, and using the answers to inform how well does this align to the needs of my business and my team today versus getting wooed by someone who just has like incredible people skills and some great stats to relay about what they've done previously and forego kind of direct conversations about the context of those wins.
So I have to proclaim real quick so we get back to it that I want to dig into what you look for in terms of qualities for top candidates to work for you. And I know you have a very specific context at your company where you're hiring and what your process even looks like to kind of vet them out. But before going there, so I just proclaim it so we get back to that tangent, which is an important one. Let's go back to Sarah's case, right? Because she actually has crushed it and reached the peak of her field in medical device. She's at a niche company. Let's say she might be making around 200K, right? And so we were talking about whether she humbles herself to go into an SDR role kind of on steroids at a top company where you can make some SDRs at AWS make 150K with equity, and that's a great company and you can move up quick. Or if she goes for a mid-market AE role, into a closing role or selling an SMB, what's your advice? Because I'm going to actually share this with her. You've already given great advice. So just your high-level perspective on what she should think about with that level of experience.
It makes me curious. Sarah is not singular.
There are other Sarahs.
I deal with a lot of candidates that have really wonderful sales experience outside of a SaaS tech sales context that get it in their heads that they want to get into tech sales. And the question I always ask is why.
I can give you that answer.
Sure.
By the way, what she said. So more flexibility rather than being in the operating room. Mm-hmm. And I've heard this from other sellers in like food and beverage, like being a road warrior. So that flexibility and a bigger overall financial upside longer term. I mean, we do pretty damn well, right?
Yeah.
And looking for a change after 7 years, I think maybe a little more stimulation. So that's what you told me. So by the way, this is so fun to do a real world example and get a kind of what I'd call a guru's perspective. And I know you probably don't want me to call you that, but
I don't. But it's
it's like my technical counterparts are like, don't call me an expert in my sales role.
It's good and relevant context that she spent 7 years there. I would still ask the question why and kind of press a little bit. Not to be a jerk, but to introduce new information. Confirmation bias is a real thing. We get things in our head and then we look for opportunities and excuses to kind of validate our thinking. It's a human thing. I'm guilty of it myself. But I would really press and challenge the trade-off for flexibility in schedule is you may be working in an environment that you don't know, have never been in before, and you're going to do it at home by yourself in your apartment or at a rented desk. I am much better at my job when my team is in office. The last 4 years managing in fully remote environments, hiring, onboarding, day-to-day coaching and development of talent in a fully distributed or remote environment, a work from home situation, is harder. It's much harder, and it's harder for me, and it makes it harder for the staff members as well. And so there's trade-off there, right? And so I would challenge her to ask herself some of these questions around how do you get up to speed quickly when you don't get to walk across the hall and talk to your boss, when you don't get to interact with your prospects every day face-to-face, right? She likely has long-standing relationships with physicians or surgeons that she's been working with at practices that they know her and she knows them, right? And now we're going to go into this like really interesting anonymized, a lot of like cold emails, cold calls to
Yeah.
strangers, a lot of being ignored, a lack of engagement, coupled with doing it all likely from home, trying to educate yourself on the motion, the buyer, the product that I represent, right? And doing that all to some degree asynchronously in a remote environment. Now, if she's got opportunity to be in office, that might be a priority. I often, and with candidates, will encourage them to take time outside of the interview to really think deeply about their negotiables and their non-negotiables.
Yes.
And that goes beyond, like way, way beyond compensation and flexibility in the role. What kind of manager do you want to work for? What kind of products speak to you? I know for myself, I'm not real keen on anything in cybersecurity. My brain's not wired for it. I'm not intrigued by it. I can't like get excited. And I also know myself, which is I'm a much better seller into sales function, marketing function, revenue operations to some degree by category, like retail tech. But I am a touchy-feely people person, and so I do best selling into functions where that is centered as well. The technical, objective, numbers, code-driven functions, engineering, finance, security, those are not prospects where I speak their language and they don't speak mine, and I'm not the best seller there. And so one specific example, but like thinking broadly, pre-pandemic, one of my non-negotiables was I wasn't going to spend more than 40 minutes in the car commuting on average. I would take a job for less money that gave me time back to a degree, right? I'm not talking about taking half the pay for a job where I walk, 6 blocks to the office versus spending 90 minutes a day in the car. But for me, I got to a point where I realized that my time was valuable, that I was working and pursuing opportunities to make the kind of money that I was making, not to feed my ego, not because I had some like monstrous financial goal. I wasn't trying to buy a house. I just felt like I work so that I can do the things I want to do when I'm not at work, like travel and adventure and spend time with people I love. And so that was one of my non-negotiables for a very long time before the pandemic hit and we all got pushed to work from home was I'm not going to commute, because I spent years up to that point spending as much as 2 hours a day in a vehicle sitting in traffic, and it wasn't good for my mental health. It wasn't good for my self-esteem. It didn't necessarily improve relationships. I never got good at like making phone calls to people I never talked to from the car. I was just kind of angry and frustrated sitting in traffic every day. And it had a domino effect across my life. And so it was like one of my non-negotiables is I'm not going to commute. Non-negotiable for me is like I need to know who I'm reporting to when I take a job, and ideally I've had ample opportunity to like spend time with them and share the things that I know about myself. I've spent money on mentors and coaches over the years, and I feel like I have a high degree of self-awareness, and it's important to me that I say, here's who I am in a professional context, and it's not all good and shiny and exciting, right? But I'd rather somebody know those things about me when they hire me and do it knowingly than feel like they got duped when I do something that's very much in character for me, but they were unaware when they hired me. And so it's a surprise, right? No surprises. So I think Sarah's probably well suited to think about what is just like the half step out of med device, but still puts her in a position to play to her strengths and utilize her experience. And I'd also like encourage her to go see if there are closing roles in technology companies that are med device adjacent and go for the AE role out of the gate. Because sales development at this moment in time is in an interesting, really interesting moment. And I can't say that I'm especially excited or optimistic about all of the things happening in sales development right now. I do have hope for the future, but I do think we're in an interesting like puberty phase, if you will, where we're going through some serious growing pains and kind of reevaluation of what we want to be when we grow up. If that makes sense.
So there's so many things I want to ask you about, and I know we have limited time because you got to get ready for board meetings and things. So let's go on this puberty tangent, but I want to bring you back to interviewing. I wanted to actually ask you how you think the SDR role has changed. Or where we should get back to. Let's just figure out where we want to go. Does like the thought of getting SDRing back to the old ways, does that tie into the puberty concept or not really? Are they separate?
I think that analogy probably falls off from a puberty standpoint.
Okay. Let's go with the puberty topic. Like, I'd love to hear about that. What do you mean?
We're at that awkward phase. And I think this maybe dovetails with another one of your questions, which is kind of like, where did it come from and where is it going? And the idea of getting back to things.
Great. Yep.
I think I relayed this to you when we grabbed coffee, but
Yeah.
you know, the job that I did at Bizarre Voice in 2008, the team was small. I think the entire SDR program at the time was, I was number 7 or number 8. We were at 40 a year later globally as the business grew. And I, with roughly 4.5 years of experience in recruiting, specifically candidate sourcing, which is really similar to sales development, and some actual inside sales experience, fairly transactional, kind of small business sales, but I was responsible for closing. I had about 4.5 years of working experience going into that job, and I was the junior guy on the team by a good bit. I was surrounded by folks who were older than me in age, but also had, 10 years of selling experience under their belt. We were not today's kind of classic recent college grad hires. We were folks that brought both selling, cold calling experience to the table, as well as a degree of business acumen, just kind of like a basic understanding of the way that businesses worked, both from our own experience internally at our companies, right? You just kind of like learn more about how a business functions by being in it, but also by proxy of having sold. Like the 7, 8 of us had experience selling across a multitude of verticals and buyers and deal sizes. And so individually, we had a leg up on kind of today's recent college grad hiring profile in terms of just baseline business acumen. But we also had the benefit of each other. It was an in-office environment, but even in the absence of being in office together, we had like a really nice mix of experience where as a team, we would come together and compare notes about what had we done at past jobs that is working well today at Bizarre Voice and what wasn't, and what does that mean for us? We pretty quickly, after I joined, got into a monthly brown bag session, but get all the SDRs in a room and talk about what's happening and what are we trying and why, and what's working and not. And I find that the recent college grad profile is just, you don't know what you don't know. And so if you've never been in a business where you had the opportunity to kind of watch and observe how to sales and marketing and sales development and operations all play together to make this thing work, you're at a disadvantage. If you've never had a sit-down conversation with the person internally who does the job that your buyers do, you can't have a high degree of empathy for the role, the challenges they face, their consideration factors, right? And that's an easy hack, just as an aside for kind of modern sellers with limited experience, is if you're selling business to business, it stands to reason that you've got somebody in-house that does the job that your buyers do. Go find them and talk to them. Ask them questions. If I were trying to sell you our company, like, how should I think about that? And how would you think about it? And what kind of framing or language or reference points, ROI stories are going to resonate with you? That's super low-hanging fruit.
What a great aside. That's golden right there.
Yeah. So I think there are a couple big challenges for today's modern SDR. I find one of them, again, is as the role became more prevalent, I had a really unique opportunity to work for Aaron Ross, who wrote and published Predictable Revenue.
Wow.
I read that book as a baby SDR when it was published, and then in 2020 had an opportunity to work with him directly at Predictable Revenue. But he wrote that book, and everybody kind of got it in their heads, whether business big or small, mature or in its infancy, that everybody should have an SDR program, which isn't necessarily true. But that curve, the story arc, is that as the role became more prevalent, we started to commoditize it. We turned it from a relatively seasoned kind of strategic partner to an enterprise seller, and said, just go grab any recent college grad that has decent language proficiency and hand him a computer and tell him to go
That was me.
fire off.
Coming out of Georgetown. Yeah, I went to a good school, but to your point, I didn't know what I was doing.
Yeah.
I'm glad they took a shot on me.
If you join an organization like Oracle,
it was a big one, right?
Google,
they can afford to take that risk.
Well, they can take the risk, but they're also staffed to give new hires really solid and robust onboarding, which is critical, right?
Yes.
You have to, as a hiring authority, front load the learning curve, right? We, especially in venture-backed businesses, but we don't have time and money to waste. You need the folks you hire to get to productivity as quickly as possible. And to do that, the business itself has to train and enable.
Yeah.
But if you're in a company of 12 people and a sales hiring authority and you get one hire that year, you're probably going to hire an individual contributor, not somebody to train a team that you don't have yet. But for the person you hire, that means that a lot of the onus is on them. Again, you've got to have that like deep intrinsic drive to want to learn, to want to be good at your job. And that's not meant to, you know, throw shade at anybody who's like, I just want a job, teach me what to do. But to be successful in a startup environment requires slightly different DNA. And the flip side of that is that, like, I know about myself. You said I'm a startup junkie. I've worked in some larger organizations. It's not a good fit. Like, I have nothing bad to say about the large organizations I've worked for, Google and Canva, like wonderful people, smart, capable, incredible products. But I know myself, and it doesn't afford me a high enough degree of autonomy and agency to play with other functions. If I'm in a frontline or midline management role in an organization of that size, there are people that are much better suited for those roles. So I fear I may have strayed from the question
No, this was
itself,
so
but
good. You just unpacked a couple brilliant nuggets, man, on how to think about if you have the right DNA for a startup, how to talk to people at your organization who are the end users of the technology you're selling internally to learn to actually gain empathy for what your prospects care about. I mean, we hit on so many good nuggets. And did you work at Google and Canva?
I did. Yeah,
Whoa,
I did
I didn't know that.
yeah, I did
Look at you.
Google's a full cycle selling role.
Yeah.
They launched a kind of competing product to Groupon and Living Social. And my early sales career was B2B to small business owners. So it was a really organic and natural fit. And Canva was leading an SDR program, which was a really fun and interesting learning experience, because that's probably a separate topic for another chat, maybe not with me, but the fundamental differences between PLG businesses. So organizations that by design build a accessible, pick it up, start using today type of product, often using that as a wedge to kind of crack into a broader enterprise agreement, versus the kind of legacy and more common model, which is a direct sales model. Canva taught me that there is a significant difference between the selling motions and thus the way you staff and measure and et cetera. And again, wonderful companies, just, if we go back to the sports, like, I know what my sport is, right? And I've kind of dabbled with similar sports and decided I want to keep coming back to the SDR sport, SDR and startups specifically.
Speaking of coming back, we're getting back to interviewing. Let's go. This is a good one that's going to help a lot of people. First off, what qualities do you look for in a SDR candidate that can be successful? And I understand your sport you're playing is the startup game. So take it away. I'd love your thoughts.
Yeah. Credit where it's due. I'm going to throw out like some tidbits here that I have co-opted from others. So it's not entirely my own, but this kind of weaving together of things. Patrick Lencioni has a really wonderful library of business books that are short and easy to consume and written as fables. So they're stories. They're not these like kind of like dense business books. But the ultimate team player from his library coalesced for me thoughts that have been kicking around in my head when people say, like, what do you look for in a candidate? I would have used different language previously, but his book really solidified it for me. Humble, hungry, and smart. So in the absence of experience, I can talk some about experience and process, but as far as just like natural DNA, a degree of humility, right? I want you to have drive. I want you to be confident, but I also want you to be humble in that, to the extent that come in knowing that you don't know everything, in the same way that I show up to work every day knowing that I don't know everything and I've got room to grow. But without humility, coaching becomes really difficult when you've got employees who believe that they know everything, and it's kind of just like, get out of my way and let me run. There's a place for those folks. It's just part of what I bring to the table as a manager and a hiring authority, is that I've got coach DNA. I'm the oldest of 4 kids. I'm a small-statured guy in a sporting context. I really over-index and focus on form and technique, strategy, because I can't like just brute force my way through things. And so humility in my mind is mutually exclusive. Like the notion of, is somebody coachable? If they are not humble, they're very unlikely to be highly coachable. And I want to take more raw talent and help them grow in their careers rather than hire somebody with the expectation that you just like, here you go. You know, hunger speaks, I've used the language a few times now, but this notion of intrinsic drive, right? You have to be motivated by more than just the paycheck, especially in a startup environment, right? Like the numbers that we put on SDRs when the program is starting from scratch are our best guess as leaders. And in many cases, we are going to be wrong. And if you're purely motivated by money, working as an SDR or first or second SDR in a startup environment is probably not the way to do it. If you're motivated by being a part of something, helping to uncover the things that we don't know and get us to answers to help be a foundational player in a program that a year or 2 years from now, maybe that like rinse and repeat, everybody's making money hand over fist. If the doing up front is motivating to you, right, that's a good fit for me. And then smart, he goes much deeper on this in the book. I highly recommend like everything in his library, but less about IQ. I mean, that's kind of like table stakes today, like especially for an SDR, you have to have like good writing skills, even with all the AI out there, like solid grasp of the English language verbally and in writing. But what he's trying to call out is the EQ. So a degree of self-awareness and a general understanding of other people and how you are received. And that's, his books are largely on leadership. So it's more in the context of leadership level talent. But I do think it applies at the individual contributor level as well, which is both internally and externally understanding who you are and how you're perceived by other people. And especially in sales, the more you understand about how people perceive you, the more you can kind of change and adapt to meet your customers where they are and generally see better outcomes in sales as a result. So humble, hungry, smart, and then, the hungry piece, I can't not think of Angela Duckworth's book, Grit. But again, this concept of like intrinsic drive, like joy in the process, not necessarily joy and sole focus on the outcome. I think is really critical because even in a fairly established business, those businesses are still trying to grow. And so a top performing SDR and a rinse and repeat team, at some point the business is going to launch a new product, a version of the product that serves a different market. They're going to introduce a variable where we now need to go experiment again. And so I find that the folks who do best in sales broadly, not just in sales development, but account executives, CSMs are the ones that are constantly looking for that new or next opportunity to challenge themselves, to like purposely make things harder. So yeah, the notion of resilience and grit, I think, is also really critical in hiring SDRs.
People who embrace challenges and intrinsically enjoy the process are the ones that are going to do really well in a startup, it sounds like.
Yep.
And you look for those qualities. You look for humility and coachability. And it's just helpful to know the underpinning ways of being and ways of operating that you look for. And I'm curious, how do you evaluate to see if someone is the real deal when it comes to these areas? And what's your interview process?
Yeah. I actually have like a very clearly defined process.
Ooh, we're in for a treat.
Again, credit where it's due. So when I was interviewing for Predictable Revenue, I worked alongside Aaron, but I actually reported to his co-founder and his partner, Colin Stewart. So as I was interviewing with Colin, with a background in recruiting, I picked up on the fact that he was running me through a process that he had run before. The questions seemed very specific, and at one point I'd asked him about it, and so he shared that his process was largely based on a book written by Jeff Smart. I think he's got a co-author on it, Jeff with a G, called Who, the process for hiring A players. And again, similar to Lencioni, the focus of that book is really about like senior executive hiring. If you have one really critical hire and you can't afford to screw it up, like they did, Jeff and his co-author are academics, not necessarily like business guys. And so they led with curiosity. They did hundreds of hours of interviews with accomplished, seasoned entrepreneurs, CEOs of publicly traded companies, that kind of thing, and synthesized it down into this repeatable process. Because the book was oriented toward leadership hires, I had to like simplify to some degree. There are parts of his process that just aren't really applicable or appropriate for an SDR interview process. But the foundations of it, whether, regardless of what you ask, my advice to hiring authorities who care what I have to say about it, be consistent in it. I ask every candidate the same series of questions at every step in the process, which does a few things. It allows me to set a much better baseline. In hindsight, I was the SDR manager scrambling 15 minutes before the meeting to, the interview, to pour through a resume and to try to come up with bespoke questions for that candidate that felt relevant based on what I saw in their working history. The who approach says, ask the same 4 questions in the screen. Ask every candidate the same 4. So it affords me the opportunity to tell a candidate, hey, Chris, thanks so much for meeting with me today. You're at step 1 of the process. I've got 4 questions for you today. I ask every candidate the same 4 questions. There's no right or wrong, right? And we'll save some time at the end for you to ask me questions as well, because we're interviewing each other. That's my opening spiel on a phone screen. It gives the candidates confidence that there is a standardized measuring stick, which is important. I think candidate experience is something that we may not talk about enough as recruiters and hiring authorities, but it matters a lot. Like, the ecosystem is only so big, and so if you give a candidate a really poor experience, they're probably going to tell somebody about it, and that company may miss out on a really stellar future hire because that person heard terrible things about the interview process. And on my side, it basically squashed my prep time to nothing because I didn't have to think about the questions I was going to ask in advance. And the same is true for the second step in the process. There's 6 questions at step 2, but similarly, I ask everybody the same 6 questions. And the book is really fascinating because it debunks a lot of, call them old wives' tales, like misinformed common logic about the types of questions you can and should ask in an interview process. And a big one is they kind of throw some shade and back it up with some science. These questions, like the happy hour question or the canoe question, right? Like, could you see yourself grabbing a beer with this person? Like, that doesn't actually tell you anything about their ability to do their job, and it's also entirely subjective. And so the questions are largely centered on, Chris, tell me a story about something that you've done before. I want to use your answer about things you've done in the past to do my own mental math on, does that translate into the needs of the job you're interviewing for today? Or is it good experience? It's just not especially relevant to the needs of my business and my team today. So, tell me what you're really good at. Like, I frame it slightly differently, but the heart of the question is, Chris, like, this is your opportunity to brag and boast as a selling professional. What do you feel like your superpower is? I want to understand how you self-identify. And so if you lead with, I'm an incredible hunter, I love the chase, and I actually don't mind the research to get there, it's all kind of part and parcel of this process, that, in my mind, you get a point toward like good fit for the role. If you say, I really love being on the road and being in front of customers, you come from maybe a door-to-door selling environment, that's a ding against you, because I'm hiring for an inside role where you're going to be stuck behind a computer, sending emails and calling strangers and largely not interacting with prospects a whole lot. Whereas if you've been door knocking for Cutco or selling encyclopedias or something, and you get to interact with humans on a regular basis, and that really gives you joy and you think you're good at it, awesome for you. Not great as far as fit for the role. So there's between that first and second interview, a series of questions that get the candidate talking about themselves, what they feel they're good at, what they're not good at, where they struggle. I'm also assessing throughout for what is their degree of candor and self-awareness. If I ask them what they're not good at and they give me a list of bullets that directly corresponds to the role requirements, they lack a degree of self-awareness, or they're just brutally honest. Right? Like, if I say you got to have A, B, and C, and they're like, I hate doing A, B, and C, or I'm really bad at A, B, and C. Again, it means lack of self-awareness or a high degree of candor. And then I'm going to dig into that and say, like, why are you interviewing for this job if the things that sap your energy, that, you really struggle with, that you don't enjoy doing, those are the primary responsibilities of the job you're interviewing for. Like, why are we here? So, focus questions. Everybody gets the same ones. I've got 2 interviews, and then I move them into a practical exercise because I think there's proof in the pudding.
I got to dig in a little bit, but are you willing to share a couple more questions? I realize, candidly for the audience, I want to get all of your questions, but at least maybe like a couple more examples, and you already gave great examples.
So I'm a big fan of, two birds, one stone type of things with the interview questions. I'm both asking the question to get the answer, but I'm also like reading a layer or two deeper. The opening question is, hey, Chris, I've seen your resume, but in your own words, what were you hired to do? And I'm seeing how well you understand that you're kind of either meant to correlate your answer to the role requirements as stated on my job description, or just get some color commentary that I can't glean from a LinkedIn profile or resume.
I like that one.
And so there's often a natural follow-up, which is like, what were you hired to do? And you've been there for a year. Is that actually what you were doing? Or tell me more. Is there any delta between the job you thought you were taking and the job you found yourself doing?
Is there one more you could give us?
I'm
really pushing you here.
It's in your own words, what have you done? What are you really good at? And I give them permission to brag and boast, right?
Cool.
It's, again, maybe a conversation for another time, but I'm big on trying to build a fairly diverse team. And so giving folks, often women and people of color who tend to shrink themselves, not, boast. I want to give people permission to,
I love that,
to really like talk to their joy. What is it that you love about your job? What is it that, and I tend not to frame it as strengths and weaknesses, but rather drivers and drainers. What are the things that you feel like you're naturally good at that you get to do every day at work that like fill your cup? And then what are the things that, that complimentary question is, what are the things that you do that you're not necessarily bad at, but that sap your energy, the necessary evils of the job? And then I'll often give the example, but it's like in technology sales, account executives hate updating the CRM, right? It has to get done, but they hate doing it. And that will often spark ideas from the candidate, whether I give them a little nudge or not, to talk about, I had to do this thing, it was really cumbersome, I hated doing it, the end. Or I had to do this thing, everybody had to do it this way, it was really cumbersome, but I asked the question, can we do it better or smarter? And so I partnered with my manager to experiment with something new, and we rolled it out to the whole team and turned it into kind of a success story about how they got creative and drove some organizational change by looking at a broken or inefficient process and being the catalyst to change it for everybody. The stories that come out of these questions are really, really wonderful and insightful. The second interview tends to dig a little bit deeper and get specific. So tell me about a big win. And again, I'm just looking, the context is that I'm typically hiring in a startup environment, the first or second SDR, and I'm not necessarily looking for, while I enjoy them, I'm not looking for the story about like the biggest meeting you bagged. Everybody's got one of those stories. I really love and tend to lean in toward candidates who say, I got there and this job was really hard and there wasn't a lot of support and I had to figure things out on my own. And so like, here's some of, here's a story or two about something that I feel like was a really big win, but it doesn't necessarily translate to like a meeting on the board or a deal qualified or a closed won customer, right? So like cracking the nut on building automated workflows to give themselves back 2 hours a day. I really love that type of stuff, like creative, outside the box thinking, getting out of a fixed role mindset where like my only job, again, the way I talked about myself early in my career, strategic wind up toy, like pull the string, I'm going to send the emails, make the calls, which was true. But even then I was a whole lot more than that. And I allowed myself to kind of like self-identify as just a cold caller, just an SDR, when the truth was I was hanging out with the head of marketing, who's like still a friend and confidant to this day, like wandering over to the marketing pit and asking conversations about that webinar we had coming up and the live event that we were doing and how can sales development partner with marketing. And those were the initiatives that actually like made my name stick at that organization, not just being at the top of the leaderboard for SDR, because without doing some of that work, wandering out of my own little box and talking to other parts of the organization to think outside the box, I couldn't have achieved the outcomes I did. They went together, right? It wasn't just that I was like solely a beast on the phone. It was like, how do I do things like a little bit different to get like much larger returns on my work?
So we don't have much time because you got to get going. So I just want to make sure I hit on a few final key points and then we send you off to do all the things you got to do. So what is the sales exercise real quick, like at a high level? Because this will be helpful to the audience who might be interviewing in other circumstances. They can have an idea of how to prepare. Because otherwise, to some people like Sarah, that's a black box right now. So what's the sales exercise?
Yeah, and I'll start up front by saying I'm happy to share the exercise. It's been a labor of love. I've tinkered with it for a decade now. But also it's something that as a candidate, whether you're asked to do it or not, if you really want to get that job and want to shine, do it of your own volition. Do it voluntarily and hand it to the hiring authority. It's a good exercise. I will explain it, I promise. But on the heels of it, after the candidate has delivered their homework assignment, we'll do a debrief and I ask, like, what was your experience like? Did you enjoy it? Did you hate it? What parts of it were really fun and easy? What parts did you feel like you struggled with or could have done better? And on the whole, 8 out of 10 candidates have really incredible feedback about the exercise because it forces them to kind of live a day in the life of an SDR at my company before I actually hire them. And it often sparks a lot of questions for them about how do we do this, or how are you going to train me to accomplish that? And it's just a really fun and interesting exercise on both sides. To take a step back, when I interviewed it at Bizarre Voice, again, Kayn led the process there. Bizarre Voice had a kind of exercise phase. A lot of interview cycles have some portion of the process that put work on the candidate. And at Bizarre Voice back then, it was a live pitch. And a few years later, when I started hiring SDRs on my own, I had this realization that, a couple things. Role plays are just uncomfortable. Even if you work at an organization, even if you've been role playing with your boss for months and months, it's just naturally a kind of unnatural experience. And it raises kind of fear, stress, anxiety level on a candidate. And it's also really unfair to the extent that, at Bizarre Voice, even fully ramped, confident role, kicking ass, I wasn't leading demos myself with customers. So why would they screen for that? If that is not going to be part of the job I'm going to do in the first 6 to 12 months, then why screen for that in the interview process? And it's really unfair to the candidate to ask them to fully and wholly and well represent a company that they don't work for, right? This is a finite timeline. Your candidate spends 2-3 weeks in process. They have maybe a day or two to try to become an expert and then pitch to people who work there that know all the ins and outs. The power dynamic is just really skewed. And again, the bigger thing for me was that if I want to screen for anything, if I'm going to put work on the candidate, I want to put them as close with the exercise to the job I will expect them to do in the first 30 to 90 days when they're ramping. And that is not leading a 15 or 30-minute presentation with a prospect. What I expect of them in the first 30 to 90 days is to understand our ICP enough to build good fit account lists, to identify people within those organizations that we should approach that can either make or influence a purchasing decision. I need them to be able to articulate our value proposition in writing and verbally. And so my exercise takes a step back from this role play where we've secured the meeting and now the SDR is going to pitch. It takes it back a couple of steps and I ask them to build a list of companies and I give them loose filter criteria. It's typically a situation where based on my filter criteria, there may be as many as 1,000 companies that come up in their search, and then I want them to narrow that down.
So we had some technical difficulties and the video cut off right before Seth's final message, which was an encouraging one. So I wanted to share it secondhand. If you're a current SDR, appreciate where you're at and don't rush your career journey. The SDR role is a place where you can make more money than ever before. You can develop great skills and connections. And a lot of SDRs go into different avenues in different companies and then find their way back into the SDR org, which is more and more appreciated at organizations, and SDR leaders are having a seat at the revenue table, aligning to CEOs, and it's a really impactful area to be. And Seth even shared that if you're 40 years old and you're going to retire at 65, at 40, you've worked about half or less than half of the hours you're going to work in your career. So puts in perspective that even at 40, you're just getting started. To your success in tech sales and in life, happy selling and happy living, and we'll see you in the next one.